It gives me great pleasure to introduce Fabio Tallon, and thank you so much for joining us all the way from Scotland. I must say, I also had a bit of a chuckle when I came across one of your profiles where you describe yourself as a full-time human and a part-time philosopher. So I thought we're going to put that to the test and see how human you are. I think Fabio's journey is very interesting. So he is South African. He studied at Stellenbosch. He did PPE, which is Politics, Philosophy, and Economics at Stellenbosch University, and his honors and masters as well. Then he went to Germany to do his PhD. And specifically of interest, I think, to the advanced diploma students who are doing sustainability in the digital age at the moment, he focused on the kind of philosophical underpinnings of technology and how it might impact society. And now from Stellenbosch to Germany to Scotland, he is at the University of Edinburgh, a postdoctoral researcher looking at the interplay between technology, ethics of artificial intelligence, moral responsibility, and free will. So I sometimes, whenever I hear AI, I kind of go like, ooh, I don't really know what it is, so I don't really know how to think about it. I think I sit with a bit of uncertainty myself around, I want to be excited about it, but at the same time, I've watched too many sci-fi movies, so I'm also perpetually afraid that the robots are coming for us. And so tonight we really want to, at a very broad level, unpack what this means for us going forward if we know our world is already in crises. Is there a possibility that something like AI and these types of technological advances might mean potential solutions? And what are the things that we want to think about and try and have precautionary principles in place? So, Fabio, are you ready to prove that you are human and
I'm
not
gonna
a
try.
bot? Okay, so I've prepared a couple of short rapid fire questions. The first thing, most importantly, what is your favorite South African food?
Oh my God, that's a really difficult one.
That's how we know you're human.
All gold tomato sauce.
All gold tomato
That is
sauce.
what I miss most from South Africa, like from a food perspective. It's strange, but there's only Heinz here, and it's not good. So,
Okay. And when you are not researching, how do you spend your time?
running up and around things.
Up and around, like parkour vibes.
No, no, just like hills.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to give you short sentences to complete.
Hmm.
There's no right or wrong answer. Just go with your gut. I depend on technology for.
My job,
I think most of us do. AI excites me because.
because being scared can be exciting.
I worry that AI might.
Make already existing problems way worse.
Okay. A sustainable future looks like.
Hmm. Looks like proper governance.
Oh, yeah, good one. Okay, so the way we want to run this evening, Fabio's prepared a very brief presentation for us. There's a Q&A function as well. So I'm going to suggest that, thank you for sharing where you are in the chat, but that we move over to the Q&A function of the webinar as well. So as we're talking, if something sparks a thought or something you want more clarification on, please drop us a note in the Q&A. And then after Fabio's presentation, I might follow up with a couple of questions myself, and then we'll go through any questions that you might have. Okay, I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to you.
Cool. Can you see my slide loading?
Yeah.
Can you see them already? Okay, cool.
There we go. Thank you.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay. So yeah, thank you for the lovely introduction. So when I was thinking about what to actually talk about, it's quite difficult to narrow down, this broad all the conversation that's going around about AI and the sort of the hype, and also the sort of fear mongering around what this technology can or can't do. So what I wanted to talk about was trying to get a handle on how we ought to think about technology more generally, and then maybe apply that to how we might think about AI. So that's what I want to talk about a bit today. Some of the stuff might feel a bit sort of banal, but the hope is that there are certain themes we can guard against in how we think about technology, and when we apply that to AI, we can better evaluate the sort of costs and benefits or the impacts that these systems might have. So, as any presentation on technology does, I'm going to start with an example. So many of you will know about AlphaGo. AlphaGo was the system developed by DeepMind that beat Lee Sedol at Go in 2016. So this is kind of, in AI terms, this is very old news. But the question that arises in the case of AlphaGo is an interesting one, right? So AlphaGo is a program developed by a company. The company's name is DeepMind. That company is located in London, in the UK. And the program that called AlphaGo that DeepMind developed had been training for the game by playing games against itself. So the game actually, the program, the software, didn't interact with any live players in any way. It was a completely sort of sandbox environment where there was no interaction. And all the system knew was the rules. And based on that training data, the system was then able to beat Lee Sedol. So none of the human operators understood what the system was doing or how the system came to its moves. And I think there's a quote from Kasparov at some point where he says, when IBM's system that beat him, he said there was one move and he said he saw into the eyes of God, something like that. And there is a sense in which I think many of these programmers who develop these systems or are involved in developing do not understand the moves that they make or understand the complexity of the decision-making architectures that are involved in these systems. So the question that naturally arises then, and the question that many people are interested in, is who deserves credit for when these systems do something correctly? But more often than not, we're interested in the question of, well, who deserves to be blamed when things go wrong? And this is, I think, an important question in the context of AI, because oftentimes, as humans, I think there's a sort of blame-praise asymmetry in the sense that we're more likely to accept praise when we don't deserve it, and we're more likely to, and we're equally likely to try and avoid blame at any cost. And that creates sort of perverse incentives in the case of apparently unpredictable or unexplainable AI systems, because it means that when that unexplainability results in something good, we want to take credit, but when it results in something bad, we want to defer blame. So if we're trying to talk about responsible AI, this is a problem. And to illustrate this in the most hilarious case, in the case of AlphaGo, where AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol, you can see there that the UK was going to claim credit the whole time, because their little flag is right over there. I don't think you would have companies or states putting their flag on things where the possibility for blame or the possibility of things going very, very wrong would arise. So there's this asymmetry. And I think it's important that we kind of work against the prevalence of this asymmetry. So we need to figure out ways to ensure that AI is responsible by design. And part of that means making sure that we know who or what to blame or to hold responsible. So the question then is, who is responsible for responsible AI? And following from that, does it even make sense to talk about responsibility in the context of AI? Precisely because of this complexity that I've mentioned. And I'm going to try and suggest to you roughly that these kinds of questions, and I'm not going to talk about what AI is. I think that we can do in the Q&A, even though I think it's an important question. Right now, I want to keep it at a sort of very general level. And what I want to suggest is that a lot of these questions on who is responsible for responsible AI and how we talk about responsibility in the context of AI depends upon how we understand technology. So to do that, we have to go back. back to the 1950s, 60s. If anyone knows this picture, these pictures, if they ring a bell to anyone, please say something in the chat. So these are pictures of Langdon. So Robert Moses was a famous New York architect, and he designed these bridges. And in the 1960s, 1970s, Langdon Winner, quite a sort of pioneering science and technology studies scholar, argued that these bridges had what he called politics. So when we think of technology, usually we think that technology, the value of a technology is linked to how it is used. So in the context of AI, we think about, well, the value of a certain AI system is the context of application, how it's going to be used in a given environment. And that's where the story ends. And Winner wanted to push back against that. He wanted to say that, no. Artifacts can have value quite independently of their use, and that artifacts themselves can actually be political. Right? Artifacts can serve political functions. So now to the story of the bridges. You might notice that those bridges are quite low. And apparently, according to Winner, that is by design. So these bridges go across Manhattan, and they basically go over routes getting you from the mainland to the beaches. And Winner argues that these bridges were unusually low so that they could prevent public transport buses from getting underneath the bridges. So the only vehicles that could get underneath the bridges were privately owned smaller vehicles. And the implication of that was that who owned smaller privately owned vehicles in the US in the 1950s and 60s? Well, it was mostly white folks. So what ended up happening was that the bridges served as a de facto discriminatory line in the sand, essentially preventing from mostly African American communities getting to those beaches by bus. And Winner suggests that this was intentional on Moses's part, but independently of whether it's intentional or not, what Winner wants to draw our attention to is that these bridges can have political effects and political functions independently of how they are used. Right? A bridge is used. You use a bridge to get over something. So its use can almost entirely be detached from the political function it's serving in this case. So it's not just that the bridges are used politically, but that they are political. So the first thing we need to keep in mind with technology, and AI is a kind of technology, is that technology is not a neutral tool. It is by design, by its very nature, it is political. And that means that we can draw on the resources of politics and governance to address issues raised by AI systems. So what this means, right, as I've said, technologies are not value neutral. They have politics. It also means that technologies do not determine human behavior, right? Technologies there's no script that we follow. There's no determinism involved in technology. But there is a very real sense in how technologies can shape who we are and the kinds of societies that we live in, right? In the case of Robert Moses's bridges, that those bridges are reinforcing a racially segregated kind of society. So the political function is baked into the technology, and appropriate mechanisms of governance might have prevented that from happening. But it's just not the case that we can just look at the use of a technology and let that be the whole story. So the implication then is that the use doesn't determine value, and responsibility then turns on us humans, right? We have the ability to decide and control what kinds of technologies we make, how we deploy them, and in which context they're used. And we need to have a sensitivity to all of these factors in order to deploy them in a way that benefits the most amount of people and doesn't discriminate against marginalized groups. But there's a problem with that, and I'm sure many of you would have thought about this. The problem is basically that people say, well, AI, yes, all these lovely views about technology in general, but AI is new. AI represents something inherently unpredictable and crazy, and there's no way that our old mechanisms of governance or understandings of technology can deal with this. And the problem basically then is, again, well, who's responsible in these cases when AI is understood not just as a technology, but as a scientific enterprise, in the sense that the machine learning models allow us to peer into or get access to novel patterns that no human individually would have been able to uncover. So we're learning new things about the world through these systems in a way that bridges and speed bumps and sort of more material kinds of artifacts wouldn't allow. So the question of who's responsible then becomes a bit more complicated because we're dealing with new knowledge, knowledge that's not necessarily dependent on any one or group of people. So you can kind of see the problem like this, right? I see there's two horns of responsibility in the case of AI. So we say normally the manufacturer operator of a machine is held responsible. And the reason that they're held responsible is that they can foresee the expected consequences of whatever's gonna happen. But these new AI machines or AI algorithmic driven systems are by their nature unpredictable because they can learn from whatever experience, and they use experience in like a very loose sense. So their behavior cannot be reliably foreseen, which basically means that we can't hold the producers of these systems responsible, right? So that means, if you're looking at a company like OpenAI who's developing GPT software, Google with Bard and all of those things, seems like how could those individual software developers, those companies, have foreseen the potential ways that the system might have behaved? And maybe in that case, you could argue, well, they could have foreseen it. They did a lot of testing, but at least in principle, it seems like there's diminished responsibility, at least at some level. And in this way, there's something like a potential for a gap in responsibility. So responsible AI then doesn't look very promising. Even if responsible technology, in some general sense, looks promising, we might have a problem with responsible AI because of this unpredictability. And I think that's just a load of BS. So what I want to suggest is that that's if you're getting sold that, you're getting sold a lie, because that's not how these things, or at least how I read these things going. And I think there's some really interesting theoretical resources we can draw on in order to sort of make that argument. So the first thing is to ask, well, what are we doing when we assess technology in general? Again, going back to these general claims. We're not just assessing technology, right? We're not just trying to figure out technology, because technological systems are always embedded in a specific context, right? So we can't just assess the technology, we have to also understand the context. So then we might say, okay, it's not the technology, it's the consequences of the technology. But again, that can't be right either, because the consequences of technology, strictly speaking, don't yet exist, right? We can't assess those consequences, they haven't yet happened. So what are we doing then when we think about potential consequences? Is that we're projecting expectations or imaginations of what these consequences might be. And that's precisely what we're assessing when we assess technology. We're assessing the projected or expected imaginations of what we want or what we think the future might be like. And for that's already an unpredictable enterprise, right? Unpredictability doesn't change the situation too much. It makes it a bit more difficult, but it certainly doesn't mean that there's a gap, right? It doesn't mean that just because we can't predict the exact effects, we can't engage in something like technological assessment, because we all have narratives and imaginations and projections and expectations of what we want technology to be like and what we think society ought to be like and how technology ought to fit into that society. And that's, I think, a far more fruitful way of thinking through these kinds of problems. So the implications of this, if there's anything you take away, is basically if AI systems really are unpredictable, that does not undermine our ability to use them and develop them and deploy them responsibly. What AI will be depends in part on what we want and imagine it to be collectively, right? And this is, you can see how this directly links to questions of governance and how we understand AI's place and role in society. Where AI is located and how it's used is a choice. It's not an inevitability. It's not deterministic. We have agency in this, and we are the ones who are responsible. And perhaps some people are more responsible than others, i.e. the ones with capital and massive data centers. But we can hold those people and those companies to account in a way that means that they can't hide behind sort of unpredictability or things like that. So what this means is that we should not be fooled by technological determinism, the idea that technology is sort of this runaway technology and there's nothing we can do about it, or unpredictability. Democratic and rights-based approaches to the governance of AI, I think, are incredibly important, and the OECD and the high-level expert group in the European Union have been doing really good work on these, and even the African Union has a lot of funding for responsible AI projects in Africa. And one simple way to sort of a little theoretical bait and switch that philosophers like is to try and think about AI not as having consequences, because consequences, you know, kind of suggest a cause and effect relation, that there's some effect, and if you just sort of spool back the reel enough, you'll get to a one specific cause that gave rise to that effect. But perhaps a better way to think about it is in terms of impacts. Impacts don't evoke this kind of causal chain, but rather say, well, what might happen in the future should we introduce a system in this or that way, as opposed to saying this system might cause this or that to happen. Yeah, so I don't think hopefully I didn't take up too much of your time, and I hope you have lots of questions for what I've just said. So thank you.
Thanks, Fabio. Yeah, I had to switch my video off because I was just nodding along too much, and I thought it might look weird on the recording if you see me nodding along. We're such a small group that I also feel, you know, if you don't want to pose a question in the Q&A, I think you can still raise your hand in the webinar, and I think then I can give you mic privileges so you can ask your question live. I certainly have a couple of questions. I think when we were planning this meeting, I kind of joked with you and I said, well, one of the obvious challenges for South Africa when it comes to AI is that most of the time we don't have electricity. So in many ways, we might be left behind. But yeah, I think maybe if especially as a South African in a European setting, maybe are there any specific vulnerabilities or challenges that you foresee us facing and maybe being left out of or left behind in the technology AI space?
Yeah, I think there are very real potential harms, and I think we're seeing them already when we look at any sort of precarious, like if we look at, I think Uber is a really interesting case of this, where what we have is a lot of venture capital money coming into a market that's composed of predominantly people working on short-term or vulnerable kinds of contracts, and then hoovering up demand in that already localized space and replacing it with a hollow version of the original. And I think that's the worry that we have when we look, especially in South Africa, we look at these opportunities for AI in healthcare, service provision. There's a lot of opportunities, but the worry is that we hollow out what we mean by healthcare by replacing it with AI-driven diagnostic tools. So I think, again, we need to think about what kinds of societies do we want, and from there develop our technologies, not just accept technologies as they are introduced, say in other contexts where maybe they work. I mean, I don't want to make any blanket claims. Maybe there are some cases where the introduction of AI has been incredibly successful. I think in medical diagnostics is one case, you know, like recognizing, reducing the cost of recognizing cancerous tumors, and how I mean, that's been fairly successful across the board. But if you don't have the infrastructure or the training data to get that kind of project off the ground, what ends up happening is that you have a system that doesn't really work. So yeah, my worry is always this sort of transplanting things developed in the global north and trying to apply them, for example, in the context like South Africa, and ending up with a hollowed out version of what might have been a pretty bad thing to begin with, but then is made worse with the introduction of AI systems.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you were talking about some of the examples, and it made me think a little bit about social media, and I know I might offend some of the younger people in the call this evening, and I'm also giving away a bit of my age, but I remember when I came to university when I was 18 years old, I got my first email address, and Facebook had started becoming a thing at that stage, but you know, I had 18 years of life without being bound to a cell phone, without being online without having this virtual persona that I needed to maintain, right? Like real relationships, still filled with drama, still passing notes and, like all of those things, but everything felt a bit more contained. And I think when I think about something like social media, and social networks, I don't know that the intention was ever for it to become something that people become addicted to, or that start to have negative impacts on the mental health of young people. But yet here we are, the more research we're doing, the more and more we see a lot of potentially unforeseen consequences, but a lot of negative impacts. And I think for me, it's that same story. Ooh, we can do something like a social network. We can now connect with people across the world. Oh, we can share photos. We can do all of these things without the question of should we be doing these things. And I guess the same, like who's responsible for keeping tabs on what's actually happening.
Yeah, and I think even linked to social media is a really good case, because I always my favorite strategy is follow the money with these things. So like with social media, what do? You follow the money. Well, you follow the money to California, you follow the money to a certain kind of um, homogenous white dude coding in a basement. And well, that's the person who's leading the company. That's the person whose values get embedded in the decisions made in the company, and there's no democratic oversight to that company besides appeasing shareholders. Then what you get is a system that precisely can't be responsive to these kinds of even if they're unforeseen. Fine, we can say, no one could have known that things would have turned out this way. And I think, maybe some people did, but let's be fair, maybe no one could have known. Even in that case, if you have a democratic system where there's democratic input and you're not just trying to increase the value of the company, then maybe you stop, or maybe you make different design decisions. But yeah, that's one of the real problems, is that where these values come from are located, they're in geographical space, and they're in like a certain, neoliberal space, and that influences the kinds of technologies that are designed. And that links again to this transplant problem of, well, if the values at the core of the technology are coming from a place whose values are not aligned with the values of the context of application or the use case on the ground, then I think you're going to have the social media problem repeated, just in different ways.
Well, I like that idea of the kind of, it's in the design and then the questions, but then what do we do? And it made me think now of maybe some environmental things, right? So we used to have CFCs in our fridges and in aerosol cans, and it probably was in there because there was some other financial benefit to having it in the product. And again, I don't think anyone necessarily set out to say, wow, I want to put toxic things in people's homes, and I want to make a hole in the ozone layer. But once we figured out that was what was happening, there was a democratic process driven by environmental activists, which led to policy changes, which removed this very dangerous thing from the environment. And I think, again, maybe the worry around some of these technological advances is it's harder to pinpoint the hole in the ozone. We could measure it, but how do we actually monitor what the impacts are? How do we report on these things?
Yeah, and I think there's a clear link. If you're thinking about the responsible creation and deployment of AI, I mean, you can't have responsible AI doesn't exist in a planet that's burnt itself to a crisp. That doesn't work. So there is a very real sense in which ecological sustainability is baked into the very idea of having anything like responsible AI. And we see that now, with these massive data centers, these cloud computing centers. They're generating an insane amount, or burning up an insane amount of fuel and energy, and that needs to be part of the conversation as well. We need to be reckoning with the fact that yes, you can have ChatGPT as your personal assistant, you can use Copilot, but what are the real environmental costs of doing that? And this is, I think you touched on it with the ozone hole. This is the real problem, is that those costs are so hidden right now that they're hidden behind a layer of user experience that you think, oh well, I'm just using ChatGPT. Look how well designed this is. Look, it looks like it's typing. It's so friendly. There's a real sense in which those costs are being hidden from us. So the problem is now not just that we want democratic sort of oversight on these things, but that in order to get that democratic oversight, you need people to know, right? You need an informed you need people to want to get involved. You need people to realize that there's a problem. But if there's so many layers between your experience of the phenomenon and the actual cost, then it's unclear how you really get there.
Yeah, I think all the students in the call who've had a module with me know this. So I teach sustainable design, and it's one of the things that we often talk about, that our biggest problem is the way we design things, and in our design process we separate ourselves from the impact and the consequence of using a system. And we went to the landfill site just last week with the second years, and we throw things away and they go to a magical place called away, and we don't have to think about them. And we open a tap and we don't necessarily even know all the processes and the journeys the water went through from the dam to get to our tap. And we are so in many ways divorced from the physical systems that we're interacting with. And then, like you said, the digital space, because it's virtual, it's very easy to forget that it has an environmental footprint. And if it has an environmental footprint, it means it has an impact on society. And we know that a lot of kind of the resources extraction that happens in order to power these kinds of technological systems, as well as the impacts of climate change, are going to affect Africa, and they're going to affect us a bit more. And I think that's something that's really difficult to grapple with. So not only are you kind of the country and the continent that kind of provides a lot of the resources, but then you don't get to necessarily benefit from reap the benefits from it, and you're stuck with the consequences.
Yeah, and I think Kate Crawford, I've just put it in the chat. She's got a book called Atlas of AI, and that book is basically, she goes from like the minerals. What are the actual raw materials that are the basic units, the building blocks of this AI revolution, and she traces those materials as they are refined, at all different parts of the world, and how this all comes together. And it's not just this linear process. There's so many different actors involved. So again, it really does become a question of, well, it's not just one thing that you can do to help. And there is no place called away where all these things go to. There are only just sort of cycles that repeat in harmful ways. And so the question of design, I think, is also a really important one. And there's a lot of really interesting work from Dutch scholars on sort of like value sensitive design and things like that, where there are attempts to actually bake in values to the design process, so that designers are thinking about what kinds of values they want to embed, not just into their products, but how those values will interact in different cultural and social settings, so that the right values come out in the product at the end of the day. So there's a distinct interest in thinking about, well, how do we make technology value laden in a good way? If technology is not neutral, then it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be bad all the time. It can be good. It can, like the stupid example is always speed bumps. And speed bumps really do embody the value of safety in a very tangible way. Like you got to slow down. There's nothing you can do. They make things safer. So I don't know what the equivalent is for thinking about the environmental costs of AI, but certainly there are very material ways we can think about these things and help designers think about these things.
Guys, you're welcome to hop in. Otherwise, I might just take up all the time this evening. So if you do have a question, please feel free to speak now. Jason, I'm looking at you. I know you guys have had some great debates this week in sustainability for the digital age. I think maybe because I don't want to come across as a conspiracy theorist, what good might come? How might AI potentially help us achieve SDGs? Although I think it's a separate debate whether we should be all that invested in the SDGs. But yeah, what good might come from AI? Because I think there's so many memes doing the rounds of, I thought AI was going to come and make my job better, but actually it's just taking the work from artists who were struggling anyway. We're same with social media. We thought we were going to feel more connected, and ultimately we're just making acquaintances and having more superficial relationships. So what good might come from AI?
So it's interesting. The one example. So we run a conference every year in South Africa, an interdisciplinary conference, and we have submissions from computer scientists and sort of young researchers in South Africa. And what we've seen is a very big uptick in South Africa in research on AI applications for translation work. And that's really interesting when you have a country that has, as many official languages as South Africa does, and you have government gazettes and reports that are mostly published in a few languages that are spoken by, I don't know the exact percentages, but there's a lot of people who are excluded by the languages that those government reports are written in. And if you want to have proper translation to make sure that those reports are available in all 11 languages, that's resource intensive, time intensive, and it can take a while before those reports can actually then get published. So one thing that people are looking into is to try and develop translation services for these languages that have been left out. And that's difficult because, as you know, AI is trained on data, and a lot of these languages, there isn't a corpus. A corpus does not yet exist. So one of the interesting economic upsides of this is that, well, people are actually going out into the field and collecting data on these different languages to have a corpus. So, people are looking in archives, they're looking in libraries to try and develop a corpus for each language so that the translation tool can work effectively. And I think that's just one use case, and I think it's a use case that really is relevant to the South African context, where you can disseminate appropriate sort of information to a large number of, and this is the democratic hope of AI, right? It can really sort of allow us to access information in a way that we never could before, in a way that is accessible to different individuals, not in sort of the TikTok version, which is that you get things that are more likely to keep you hooked on the platform, but rather you get something that you're more likely to engage with to make you a better citizen. And I think that's the opportunity lies in the risk in a way, right? If you can see how these systems can lock you in from your attention, well, in the same way they can really help us be more engaged in politics in our local community. So yeah, anyway, to go back to the point, I think this translation stuff is really, really interesting. And I think from what I saw last year, at least, there's a lot of interesting work being done in this domain as well.
Yeah, thank you. It hasn't occurred to me that it might be able to do something like that. I think I saw a short video the other day of using AI to help farmers identify pests in a field. So they attach these lasers that then, as the tractor drives, it's got these little AI scanners that go, okay, weed, that's a seedling, don't kill that, that's a weed. And then instead of spraying pesticides, it actually just manually takes out the weeds. So I thought that was quite cool. And then I think maybe my last question this evening is, because it's such a big thing, I think it's easy to go, ooh, someone else will speak up, someone else is going to think the difficult things and ask the difficult questions. But just as an average South African, what are the things I should be looking at and engaging with to be an active voice and develop my agency in terms of AI? Oh, Fabio's frozen. Sean, is it just Fabio, or is the problem on my side?
Yeah, no, he is frozen.
Okay. Let's see if he unfreezes. We'll give it 1 or 2 moments. Oh, I'm always glad when it's not the South African having the challenges, when the challenge is overseas. Okay. Yeah. Can I ask, maybe while we just hang around and see if Fabio comes back, if his connection works, any questions from you in the call still? I see some people have had to leave as we've gone along. Jason, Dom, Emerson. Sean, any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, it's Fabio's back. I'm just thinking of the divide within South Africa in terms of just basic education, secondary education, and how this gap seems to grow. And I think of the schools who are more affluent and well-funded probably are going to thrive in terms of the uptake of AI. And I wonder what can be done to bridge the gap, rather than, I mean, we've seen with technology, we've seen what happened during COVID with those who had no access to ICT and how they fell behind. And so the implication or the consequence of this, I'm just wondering, how, would it exacerbate our socioeconomic divide even further in this country? Or is there a possibility for narrowing it down?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a very real worry there, and that's my overarching worry with these systems, is that technologies tend to recreate and worsen already existing divides. That's definitely a trend. But one way that we can think about pushing back against this is that what AI has made, what systems like ChatGPT have made possible is, I mean, you don't need to be a software developer to write software anymore. You can use ChatGPT to write your software. So what we're seeing is, in a way, the kinds of skills that you might develop in a technologically limited setting, right, where you're maybe not exposed to, you don't have access to the AI systems in terms of their actual hardware, but you're exposed to things like critical thinking or ability to do advanced mathematics or things like that, which require robust, primary and secondary and tertiary education system, but don't necessarily lean on AI as such. There's definitely an opportunity there. Maybe not an opportunity, but there's scope to mitigate the harm that can come from these systems, at least in principle. I am skeptical, but there is, I think, some scope for people who are able to think outside of the box and to develop local solutions to local problems in a way that wasn't possible before.
Yeah, I think it's and maybe my hesitation around that is because I spend so much time thinking about design, is I feel if there's no intention, if there's no driver behind those things, then they tend not to happen. It's not enough to say, oh, you can now, without needing coding background, you can develop some kind of an app for your low income small enterprise in an informal setting. Sure, you can, but unless there's like an NGO actually making sure that people are educated in how to use something like ChatGPT to write code, it's a nice idea, but good things don't happen just because they can happen. Like someone has to drive that kind of transfer of resource and knowledge and awareness.
Yeah, fully agreed. Ultimately, it's a problem of directing resources in the right direction. And if that doesn't happen, you can have all the intentions in the world, but yeah.
I see Emerson and Dom are typing furiously in the chat. So we'll give them an opportunity to post their questions. I also came across a video recently where they were talking about AI that had made some kind of connection to ultimately deceive humans. And I think it was one of those like I'm not a robot thing that it needed to tick, and it couldn't tick all the boxes, and then it engaged with that website and convinced the website that they were visually impaired, and that's why they couldn't actually make the right choice, and then the website let them through. And they programmed the AI to dump its kind of decision-making thing so that they could see how it was making the decision. And it basically said, well, I need to deceive this website to think that I'm a human. And as much as I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, I've seen Will Smith in movies like this, where this kind of thing led to only bad things. Yeah, thanks, Dom. I'm just going to read your comment there. No questions, but like to hear more about the positive ways it can be used, because so much of what we hear about AI is rooted in our worry and our fear of consequences. There must be good things, and even if they're new and unpredictable and scary, there must be good things that come out of it. And I think that's also what I take from it is we can't just let it be and think something good is going to come from it. We're going to have to engage as citizens and make sure that it is being used for good things.
Yeah, but that again, it being able to be engaged as citizens requires, I'm not someone who understands activism or collective action or coordinating these things in any way, but there are people who do understand this and do know how to do this. And a lot of the time you need a kind of grassroots community-led approaches to these kinds of big problems, but at the same time you need governance mechanisms that recognize those movements as being legitimate. So in Europe, there are citizen democracies where people will be flown in from different countries in Europe, come together and workshop. These are just normal citizens, and they can workshop on problems related to AI with experts. So they're informed by the experts. They get to provide input, and that input ultimately results in I guess, more democratic forms of legislation. So that's one model by which they can work, but it's a really expensive model.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I sleep a bit easier at night, I think, is because I'm involved in our programs. And I think the power of education, especially when we can start to work in these kind of transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary spaces, is to say that we need people who know how to give voice to things. We need people who deeply understand environmental and social impact. We need people who can speak the technology language. I don't think any one of us can do all of these things, but it is really important. So someone like Jason, who's in the call, is an engineer, and I think it's when people who come from a specific discipline get to interact with values and these kind of bigger philosophical questions, and we all go into different disciplines, and we're change agents in those spaces, and we can give voice and we can contribute. I think that's often, that's the bit that makes me go, I can't fix everything, but yeah, we're training people who can have these critical conversations, and they'll land up in decision-making positions.
Yeah, and there is this also the sense, I think this comes along in like climate science stuff as well, where climate emergency is a technical problem at some level, right? It's driven by technology, but it's driven by people, and it's a social problem as well, right? It's both of those things at the same time. And I think if we think about AI as being a social, not a social problem, but a social phenomena to be governed, right? It's not a problem to solve, it's something to be governed. We can see that the kinds of expertise we need are not just technical expertise. We need expertise from, all disciplines, because AI affects all people from all walks of life. So the expertise we need has to come from, from engineers to software developers, but, there's even room for philosophers at the table for some obscure reason, but historians, sociologists, psychologists, we need a broad range of expertise in order to really make this work. And I mean, you need a broad range of expertise to make a society work. So, these principles are there. We just kind of need to reckon with them. And that's, I think, if there's any takeaway, that's what the responsible development of anything looks like. It looks like wide-ranging expertise coming together and trying to democratically decide the best way to use a technology in society.
Yeah. And thanks, Emerson. I see your comment, and I think that's maybe a good note to wrap things up with is we certainly know that there's I don't know, many of you may have seen Wall-E, the movie, and I think it is that fear that we become so lazy and we become so, I don't know, like I think lazy is just baked into our DNA, right? Like it's an evolutionary response. If there's a path of least resistance, you take it. That's how we got to the top of the food chain. So yes, there's definitely the chance that we might start to hand over our creative thinking and our cognitive abilities, and I think it's a really big concern for us in higher education. Obviously, how do we encourage students to still do the mental work, the really hard mental work, instead of outsourcing their arguments and their opinions to something like AI? But on that note, I think that's actually such a good answer to my earlier question around what can I do as just little me sitting in my own little space, is that I am still the master of my own creativity. I am still the master of my cognitive abilities. I might use ChatGPT to help me write a web copy because I don't do marketing speak, but I've still, you can actually see, like I still have paint on my hands from painting with the first years today. We still go and do our Mystica practices in the woodlands at the SI. We still have ourselves. I think maybe that's the one thing I kind of take myself back to, is we are still here. We are still here. We're still together. We're still having these conversations, and I think that's important. That's very, very important. Jay, I see you've also shared a thought. The session has made me wonder if our fear of AI taking over will ever go away, and how can we, as advocates of sustainability, contribute to the speed bumps, yes, of slowing down AI and, yeah, moving it in a positive direction? I think that's a very important question, Jay, and I don't know that there's an answer to it yet. I think it is the showing up. I think that is, for me, the first thing. It's the showing up. It's the educational part, right? It's not putting our heads in the sand now and saying like, oh, AI, I'm not a software engineer, I'm not into computers, so I'm not going to engage with it. It's these kinds of conversations is where it has to start. Fabio, any last words before we let you go?
No, I think we've covered everything. It's been really wonderful. Thanks to everyone for putting up